Iniciamos
Vamos
ya.
a iniciar.
Perfecto. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Muy buenos días y sean todos bienvenidos a esta quinta cátedra, este ciclo de cátedras en métricas responsables en ciencia, tecnología e innovación. El día de hoy vamos a tener dos presentaciones que van a complementar este ejercicio que realizamos a lo largo del año y que estamos seguros pues, va a seguir consolidando un poco esos aprendizajes y esos elementos teóricos que se han discutido a lo largo de este ciclo de cátedras. Quiero darle la palabra a Elizabeth Bernal. Ella es la coordinadora académica de ASCUN, quien nos va a hacer el saludo de bienvenida y la presentación de esta quinta cátedra. Elizabeth, muy buenos días.
Muy buenos días, Hernán. Muy buenos días a todas las personas que nos acompañan. Buenos días a nuestros expertos y expertas invitadas, Elizabeth, Laura y Stefan. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este espacio. Bueno, desde la Asociación Colombiana de Universidades, la Asociación de Editoriales Universitarias, el Consorcio Colombia, el Observatorio de Ciencia y Tecnología, la Red de Gestores de la Investigación y la Red en Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación, pues queremos agradecer a todas las personas que nos han acompañado durante todo el año. Esta ya es nuestra quinta cátedra y es la última cátedra de este año. Hemos recibido insumos tremendamente valiosos para el país y en general para un movimiento que sabemos que es mundial. Como algunos de ustedes nos han podido acompañar, estuvimos ya también en varias sesiones de las comisiones que están encargadas de construir tanto un documento de iniciativas en política pública para el ámbito, para iniciar o fortalecer cambios en el ámbito nacional y también en la línea de construir un instrumento o una guía para las mismas instituciones que quieran empezar a abordar esta perspectiva. Creo que todos y todas hemos aprendido bastante de las experiencias, sabemos que existen retos importantes que digamos, están generando cambios que requieren de un tiempo, pero ya se iniciaron en el mundo y por supuesto en Colombia también vamos a iniciar con paso firme en los cambios que se requieran. Queremos comentarles a las personas que nos acompañan que las presentaciones se van a realizar en inglés. Sin embargo, tenemos traducción simultánea. Entonces, como ustedes lo pueden observar, en la parte de abajo de la plataforma de Zoom hay un símbolo de un círculo y dice interpretación. Ustedes pueden señalar ese círculo y allí tendrán la traducción simultánea de las presentaciones en inglés. ¿Qué nos queda ahora? Esto es pues el incentivo que queríamos para avanzar, fortalecer las alianzas que se han presentado. Ya muchas personas e instituciones afortunadamente nos han manifestado su intención de incluirse en esta propuesta. Como ustedes lo saben, ya empezamos también un trabajo latinoamericano y pues un trabajo por supuesto con personas de Europa y de Estados Unidos para que el próximo año, el 2022, podamos mostrarle al país dos posiciones en relación con política pública y en relación con una herramienta que esperamos pues se conviertan en realidad. Vamos entonces a hacer, además de el análisis de todo lo que nos arrojó estas cátedras, vamos a hacer el análisis de lo que nos arrojaron las comisiones y pues esperamos el próximo año, iniciando el año, contarles los resultados y presentarles pues digamos primeras iniciativas que ya esperamos consolidar. Por supuesto, como lo hemos manifestado en todos nuestros eventos, esta es una puerta abierta. Las personas que quieran inscribirse a esta propuesta, bienvenidas. Las instituciones que quieran inscribirse son bienvenidas. Este es un proyecto de país y pues realmente consideramos que lo necesitamos y que va a traer muchos beneficios. Eso sería por ahora. Muchísimas gracias y bueno, que tengamos una muy buena cátedra.
Elizabeth, muchísimas gracias. Efectivamente, como lo mencionas, este ejercicio académico pues va a tener unos productos y unos resultados concretos que seguramente van a ser muy útiles para las instituciones. Acerca del avance de estos desarrollos y de cómo ha ido evolucionando el trabajo de la comisión académica de este ejercicio de métricas responsables, le voy a dar la palabra a César Payares para que nos cuente un poco sobre estos avances. César, muy buenos días.
Muy buenos días, Hernán. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañan en este espacio. Voy a compartir pantalla. Eh, Listo, ya me confirman si ya en mi pantalla, por favor.
Sí, César,
Listo.
perfecto.
Vale, muchas gracias. Eh, Como les dijo Hernán, voy a hacer con una breve introducción y recordatorio a la metodología que hemos venido utilizando en esas cátedras, más que todo enfocado para que todas las personas que recién nos empiezan a acompañar sepan de dónde hemos venido, qué hemos hecho y hacia dónde queremos llegar. Recordemos que la cátedra de métricas responsables, todo ese espacio es un esfuerzo donde distintos actores nos hemos unido para poder definir mecanismos de evaluación de la actividad académica que sean ajustados a las características y a los retos del país. En ese sentido, lo que nosotros buscamos no es unos sistemas de evaluación no externos, sino unos sistemas de evaluación que se ajusten a los verdaderos retos y que contribuyan a solucionar los problemas sociales y tener impacto en la sociedad. En la sociedad. En esa medida, hemos hecho una serie de cátedras académicas. Este es un espacio, esta es la quinta cátedra, donde distintos expertos internacionales nos acompañan y nos comentan las tendencias internacionales que deberíamos tener en cuenta y adaptarlas a nuestro contexto nacional, entendiendo qué elementos se miden, cómo se miden y qué implicaciones debemos tener en cuenta frente a la medición. Esa cátedra se ha construido en dos estrategias. Primero, los seminarios que les comentaba, y los segundos son las comisiones. Esas comisiones son las que les mencionó Elizabeth, son dos grupos de trabajo que tienen dos objetivos muy claramente definidos. Por un lado, está la comisión que busca construir un policy brief con el cual se den recomendaciones de política a los actores interesados en el ecosistema nacional de evaluación, no solamente desde la parte científica, sino también educación, industria, etc. En esa medida, en esas comisiones, hemos discutido sobre las dinámicas nacionales, sobre los problemas y posibles caminos de solución para la construcción del documento. Olvidé mencionar el otro trabajo de la otra comisión, que es el de herramientas, cuyo objetivo es definir una serie de guías o un instrumento en el cual se pueden basar las instituciones de educación superior principalmente para definir mecanismos con los cuales evaluar a sus investigadores. En esa medida, nosotros buscamos tener unas propuestas concretas que le sirvan al país para que sus mecanismos de evaluación y de medición tengan una visión más responsable a partir de las métricas responsables. En esas comisiones, entonces, como les decía, a nivel nacional, la primera propone acciones de política para que el país pueda definir sus orientaciones en los próximos años. Se han identificado tres ejes de trabajo. Primero, contextualizar el problema. Segundo, hacer una propuesta de medición. Y tercero, entender todo el modelo de gobernanza de la evaluación y de la medición. En esta medida, el objetivo es tener un documento que sea corto para que pueda ser utilizado por los tomadores de decisiones y que la información sea muy clara, concreta y directa, para que no haya tanta ambigüedad, sino que se pueda deducir el camino que podríamos tomar como país. Evidentemente, es un documento con bases académicas, con toda la referenciación y toda la rigurosidad de la comunidad. El otro caso, la herramienta, no está enfocada ni el país, sino que está enfocada ni la institución. Entonces, esa herramienta que proponemos, el objetivo es que se pueda ser utilizada por cualquier institución. ¿Eso qué implica? Que la herramienta ha de ser flexible para adaptarse tanto a las instituciones de orden nacional, que son más grandes, como a otras instituciones que son más de orden regional o que no tienen un tamaño tan significativo o que están enfocadas más a la docencia, etc. Reconocemos que en nuestro país hay una amplia diversidad de instituciones y queremos una herramienta que se ajuste a esa diversidad de instituciones. El objetivo también es que la herramienta esté piloteada, tener algunas instituciones, incluso algunas se nos han acercado y han dicho, participamos en la pilotaje de la herramienta que diseñemos en la evaluación. Entonces, ahí también hemos tenido avances. ¿Qué hemos hecho hasta el momento? Ese es un breve resumen de las distintas cátedras que hemos tenido para alinearnos en esta ocasión. La primera cátedra fue una introducción, le llamamos ABC de las métricas responsables. Allí buscamos traer los conceptos y generar como una base conceptual para que todos manejáramos el mismo lenguaje. Esa fue realizada por el equipo que está coordinando el proyecto de métricas responsables y fue en el mes de abril. La segunda fue en mayo. en esa medida fue un gran espacio donde distintos expertos nacionales debatieron sobre cuáles son las tendencias en medición de ciencia, tecnología e innovación. Incluso allí participaron entes estatales de los ministerios, del observatorio, creo que el DNP también, como un espacio para integrar y tener una visión nacional. Y ya en mayo también empezamos ya propiamente estas cátedras internacionales. La primera conocimos la experiencia de Métricas y la experiencia de Dora de Estados Unidos como para tener esos dos referentes. En la segunda tuvimos la participación de Ismael Rafols de la Universidad de Leiden y de Sandra Boni de la Universidad Politécnica de Valencia, donde nos compartieron la importancia de la ciencia en transición y también de reconocer la medición de lo periférico, no solamente la ciencia en línea dura, sino también todos los elementos periféricos y la diversidad en los indicadores. La siguiente cátedra tuvimos el acompañamiento de Judith Sutz y Hernán Jaramillo. En ellas nos compartieron visiones más latinoamericanas desde la experiencia que han tenido estas dos personas que son referentes en la región sobre construcción de indicadores y sobre la implicación de indicadores y gobernanza. Y el 14 de septiembre nos unimos al evento de las métricas, donde tuvimos la charla de Laura Robelli en el marco de ese evento, donde nos habló de las apuestas latinoamericanas, nos comentó la iniciativa de FOLEC para la medición de ciencias, responsable de las ciencias sociales en la región y la importancia de los repositorios. Esa es la quinta, la que vamos a tener con el profesor Stefan Kuhlmann y los profesores Elizabeth y Laura Himanen. Adicionalmente, también tenemos una comisión científica donde distintos expertos nos apoyan en las recomendaciones y nos validan o evalúan o nos retroalimentan las distintas implicaciones o las distintas propuestas y los mecanismos de trabajo que hemos venido realizando. Ese ya lo tuvimos el 13 de agosto, esperamos tener otra comisión con los avances que tengamos a la fecha. Listo. Uno de los avances más significativos que hemos tenido son estos 12 problemas que identificamos con las comisiones asesoras. Estos problemas ya están priorizados y estamos en un proceso de construcción de propuestas o de alineación de los documentos propuestas a partir de estos problemas. Voy a leerlo rápidamente, igual la presentación queda disponible y ya los hemos compartido en distintos espacios. El primero es la desconexión de indicadores con la realidad del país. El segundo es el desconocimiento de herramientas alternativas y propuestas para generar modelos responsables. El tercero es la estandarización de modelos que desconocen las simetrías, es decir, cuando utilizamos las mismas prácticas de evaluación para medir todas las implicaciones. El cuarto es que la evaluación está deslegitimada, es decir, no tiene una buena aceptación entre los distintos actores del Sistema Nacional de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación. Y el quinto es un problema tradicional de la desarticulación de nuestro sistema. El sexto es que los incentivos están muy enfocados en la parte económica y no se centran y están centrados en los individuos, lo que delimita la posibilidad de cooperación y colaboración entre los actores del sistema. El séptimo es que actores externos, distintos o ajenos al sistema nacional, tienen mucha influencia en los mecanismos de evaluación y de medición de la ciencia y la tecnología. El octavo es que la política pública de ciencia y tecnología, cuando existe, tiene pocos recursos para financiar una correcta medición. El noveno es que las métricas son muy cuantitativas y se centran en las revistas y no tienen una visión global y diversa de lo que es la calidad en investigación. El décimo es la falta de espacios abiertos para discutir entre los actores que permitan una construcción consensuada. El 11 es que los incentivos generan riesgo moral y el 12 es que es resistencia al cambio. Estos han sido los 12 problemas que hemos identificado. Con estos hemos adaptado una metodología en distintas fases que ya hemos tenido ciertos avances en la construcción de nuestras dinámicas. Últimamente en lo que hemos estado trabajando es en definir propuestas concretas para incorporar en los documentos. Lo hemos hecho a través de 3 ejes. entender cuáles recomendaciones de política deberían ser incluidas partiendo de los problemas, cuáles son los 3 aspectos metodológicos que toda institución debería incluir en su evaluación de la investigación y cuáles aspectos deberíamos tener en cuenta para evaluar el impacto en el corto, mediano y largo plazo. ¿Por qué esa última? Porque para el concepto de métricas responsables es muy importante la evaluación de la evaluación. O sea, entender el impacto que están teniendo los mecanismos de evaluación dentro del comportamiento de los actores. De hecho, es uno de los temas que aborda muy bien INORMS en su metodología SCORE. Y esta es la ruta que nosotros hemos definido hasta el momento en el camino del trabajo. Lo que están en naranja son elementos que ya están ejecutados, ya están realizados y ya hacemos avances. Lo que está en verde es lo que estamos realizando. Primero diseñamos la estrategia para incorporar el debate, conformamos las comisiones, empezamos a traer los expertos y demás, y eso ya está bien avanzado. Ejecutamos las cátedras y a partir de esas cátedras y de las discusiones que tuvimos en las comisiones, hemos aprendido los conceptos y hemos definido muy bien los problemas. Analizamos cómo es el comportamiento del sistema, qué lo está limitando y planteamos también elementos positivos que existen en el país y que también hay que reconocer. Con eso construimos los 12 problemas y con eso priorizamos los problemas y con ello estamos construyendo las propuestas. En este momento justamente estamos en la fase de construcción. Esta de hecho debería tener 2 colores porque es avanzada. Tenemos los elementos base para la tabla de contenido y ya estamos distribuyéndonos con las comisiones la redacción concreta de los problemas. Lo que seguiría es la validación. Terminamos de construir, tenemos los documentos y empezamos a validar con distintos actores en distintas instituciones la validez de estas propuestas y estas metodologías. Y no solo la validez, sino también la viabilidad de estas propuestas y de esta metodología. Y por último, el objetivo del proyecto no es quedarse simplemente en una propuesta, sino, como les decía, hacer pilotos y empezar la implementación para tener un impacto real en distintas instancias, ya sea de toma de decisiones de política o ya sea en instituciones concretas que quieran ensayar nuevas formas de evaluar a sus investigadores. En resumen, esa es una breve alineación de la metodología que hemos venido utilizando. En esta charla entonces vamos a tener a los profesores Laura Himanen y Elizabeth Gatt con Scope y INORMS y luego vamos a tener al profesor Stefan Kuhlmann con la charla de responsabilidad, innovación responsable, innovación e investigación responsable. Muchas gracias a todos.
César, muchísimas gracias. Vamos a continuar entonces con nuestra primera conferencia, nuestra primera charla del día de hoy. Nos acompañan en ella Laura Himanen y Elizabeth Gatt. La conferencia será sobre herramienta responsable de evaluación de la investigación, Scope y NORMS. En ese sentido les cuento que Laura Himanen es especialista en investigación y trabaja en los servicios de investigación de la Universidad de Tampere, Finlandia. Dirige el proyecto del ejercicio de evaluación de la investigación de la Universidad de Tampere, que tendrá lugar en 2022, y está muy implicada en el desarrollo, el seguimiento y la presentación de informes de las actividades relacionadas con la investigación, de acuerdo con la estrategia de la universidad. Es miembro del grupo de evaluación de la investigación de INORMS. La experiencia de Laura se centra en la planificación estratégica basada en el conocimiento. Está muy familiarizada con los diferentes indicadores de productividad científica, así como las metodologías de evaluación de la investigación y los rankings universitarios. Elizabeth Gatt actualmente está en la Comisión de Servicio de la Universidad de Glasgow, compartiendo el puesto de jefe de operaciones de investigación. También tiene un contrato de retención para apoyar la política de investigación de la Universidad de Loughborough. Ha pasado la mayor parte de su carrera en bibliotecas académicas y ha investigado los problemas de los derechos relacionados con las actividades académicas de la enseñanza superior en el Reino Unido. Entre ellos se centra en los proyectos de Accord, Right and River y Romeo, financiados por la Higgs. El último de los cuales dio lugar al servicio Sherpa Romeo. Tiene un doctorado en propiedad de derechos de autor y comunicación académica. Ha fundado el foro LIS CopySeek, el foro Liz Bibliometric y el blog de Bibliomagian. También es defensora del Grupo de Interés Especial de Evaluación de la Investigación de la ARMA. Preside el Grupo de Evaluación de la Investigación de la Red Internacional de Gestores, INORMS, y en el 2020 recibió el premio INORMS a la excelencia en el liderazgo de la gestión de la investigación. Quiero darles entonces la bienvenida a Laura y a Elizabeth. Muy buenos días, good morning.
Good morning. So I'm going to share my screen now. So if you'll give me a moment. Okay, can you all see my slides? Hopefully. Okay, so good morning and thank you very much for having us here today. My name is, as presented, Laura Himanen, and I'm here today with Elizabeth Gadd to introduce the INORMS Research Evaluation Group's scope framework for undertaking responsible research evaluation. The INORMS Research Evaluation Group is a group of research managers from 12 international research management societies, charged with exploring how we can ensure research evaluation is meaningful, responsible, and effective. Lizzie is the chair of the group, and I represent the Finnish Association of Research Managers and Administrators. So our purpose today is to introduce the INORMS Research Evaluation Group's work on responsible research evaluation, outline 5 arguments that can be used to persuade senior leaders of the need to evaluate responsibly, and to introduce the scope 5-step process for undertaking responsible research evaluations. In addition, we will work through this process using some real-life examples. And finally, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the scope framework and how it might be applied in different settings. Okay, so the INORMS Research Evaluation Group was established in 2018, and our primary idea was to consider how research evaluation can be made more meaningful, responsible, and effective. This idea resulted to 2 work packages, one for World University Rankings and one for engaging with senior managers around responsible evaluation. The scope framework and the 5 arguments, which you will hear in the following, were the results of the second work package. The first one resulted into a ranker ranking. And if you're interested in learning more about this, please visit our webpage or check out this Nature article written by Lizzie that's on this slide. We're also quite happy that our work has received some high-level interest, like, for example, a nomination as one of the 15 movers and shapers by a Global Research Council white paper. Before going into the scope framework, I'll say a few words about a short 1-page guide developed by the group containing 5 arguments you could use to persuade higher education leaders to evaluate responsibly. The guide can be found on the INORMS web pages, and obviously it will depend on your local setting as to which of the arguments you think might have traction. But essentially it outlines the moral argument for responsible research evaluation, that it is fairer. And institutions that engage with poor practices put their staff well-being at risk, and with it expose themselves to reputational risk. Secondly, the fact that responsible research evaluation simply leads to better decision-making. Campbell's law tells us that we get what we measure. By measuring what matters and with indicators that actually indicate those things that matter to them, institutions are simply more likely to make the best decisions that lead to the best outcomes. Thirdly, when you're potentially investing a lot of money in research staff, systems, and activities, institutions would also be wise to ensure they're investing wisely in meaningful evaluations. They're actually going to give them valid answers to their questions and not waste money on shortcuts that won't. Fourthly, the increased focus on responsible research evaluation as a result of sector agendas, including open research, improving research culture, and responsible research and innovation. Obviously, there's the Plan S, and the Global Research Council is also taking an interest in this area and actually held an online event last November on this topic. So it seems likely that further funder expectations may follow. And finally, whilst there are external drivers, ultimately, we argue that responsible research evaluation gives institutions an opportunity to maintain their institutional autonomy as mission and value-led organizations, enabling them to set and pursue their own goals and measure progress against their own goals and not the goals of others. Oops. So, scope is a simple 5-stage process for evaluating research responsibly. It encourages people to firstly start with what they value about the thing they're evaluating, consider all the context in which they're evaluating, to look at all of the options they have for evaluating before probing any proposed solution for unintended consequences prior to evaluating and then evaluating their evaluation. And we are now in the process of workshopping scope in different research evaluation settings to both develop the model further and also to write some case studies to help others who might want to apply this approach to actually running responsible research evaluations in their organizations. So before I launch into the model, I wanted to run through 3 operating principles for scope. First, evaluate only where necessary. Research and researchers are already heavily evaluated for jobs, for grants, promotions, and prizes. And there is an increasing use of evaluation to incentivize certain behaviors, open research, pre-registration, etc. There is a strong sense that over-evaluation is having a negative impact on research culture globally, particularly in terms of mental health. So this principle is really a challenge to all evaluators to say, do you really need to evaluate at all? Is it evaluation or enabling that you need to do? Measurement is not always the answer. The second is to evaluate with the evaluated. The world is recognizing the nothing about me without me principle in all walks of life. And evaluation is no different. Any evaluation should be co-designed and co-interpreted by the communities being evaluated. And the third is to draw on evaluation expertise. A criticism often leveled at research evaluation methodologies is that they do not match up to the standards of rigor we would apply to our academics research. Indicators are a poor proxy for the concept they seek to indicate. Data is not supplied with error bars, and poor survey methodologies result in misleading findings. So it's important that we draw on the appropriate evaluation expertise when designing our evaluation approaches. And if you don't have it, we need to develop it, which is what scope can help with. So let's move on to the actual framework now. And step 1 of scope is to start with what you value about the thing you're evaluating. It kind of sounds obvious, but all too often we don't start our evaluations here. We start with what external actors value, like for example, university rankings or research funders. And of course, the other thing we do here is to start with the data available to us and work backwards. This is called the streetlight effect, and it's illustrated by this cartoon. So where did you lose your wallet? In the park. So why are you looking here? Because this is where the streetlight is. Many evaluations rely on bibliometric data, not because the volume of publications or even their citedness is what they value, but because it is so readily available and so easy to use. Okay, so once we're clear on what we value, we need to consider the context of our evaluation. I hear many arguments about which indicators are responsible and which are not. But we can't have that conversation without knowing the context, the why and the what, in which the indicator is going to be used. And there are many reasons for evaluating, and this matrix lists 6 key purposes alongside various entities of different sizes. And it attempts to indicate what the associated impacts and therefore risks might be. So, for example, Plotting the publication volume of one country against that of another for the sole purpose of understanding their relative production levels has very little impact on the countries under assessment. So we've labeled that green. However, any form of assessment at the level of the individual researcher that results in reward has a high impact on those individuals, and therefore it carries a greater degree of risk. And of course, the other key context consideration is discipline. So an evaluation approach that works for one discipline will not necessarily work for another. Then we have O for options, and this is a reminder that we do have them. We don't have to reach for metrics all the time. The important thing to consider here is whether your indicator is a suitable proxy for the thing you're evaluating. We think the rule of thumb here is that generally speaking, quantitative measures are generally for quantifiable things, such as citations, publications, money, or students. And qualitative measures are for qualifiable things, for example, quality, excellence, or value. And we should be especially careful if we're using quantitative indicators as a proxy for qualitative things, as it is important to remember that citations do not equal quality, and a university's ranking position says very little about excellence. And whilst it is easy to criticize quantitative indicators, we have to remember that whilst peer review is often considered the gold standard of research evaluation, there is a lot of concern about peer review and a lot we don't understand about peer review. And the challenges of measuring both qualitatively and quantitatively are why we have the next stage of scope. Once you've developed your evaluation approach in line with your values, context, and options, the fourth step is to probe deeply. Ask yourself these 4 questions. First, who does the chosen approach discriminate against? Perhaps early career researchers or women or non-journal-based disciplines. Second, how might this approach be gamed? When there is a prize, there is a game. So keep in mind that people will optimize. Third, what might the unintended consequences be? And this question should be asked on both institutional as well as individual level. For example, if the evaluation doesn't take disciplinary differences comprehensively enough into account, it could have negative influence on the not so traditional ways of doing research, such as interdisciplinarity caused by, for example, the traditional nature of journal metrics. Or if the evaluation is too focused on bibliometric indicators, it could result to individual researchers focusing on research areas that are more visible in publication databases, or narrowing the types of publications according to assessment criteria. In other words, individual researchers start playing the game and give less emphasis on their own ambitions and aims. And finally, does the cost of measuring outweigh the benefits? It cannot be stressed enough that the cost, including the workload, should be proportional to the aims and anticipated outcomes of the evaluation. And now we've reached the last stage of the model, only to start over again. It's time to evaluate your evaluation. So go back to the start, ask yourself if the evaluation approach brought new insights to what you value. No matter how happy you are with the approach, be open to adjustments. It is always possible to do the evaluation better. And keep in mind that the area of evaluation is subject to constant change. So just because an evaluation worked previously, it does not mean it will work forever. Building in a regular view of evaluation approaches and doing so with units under evaluation is really an essential part of the evaluation process. And whilst we present scope in a linear step-by-step process, in reality, it is of course a very iterative process. Now I'd like to see if my colleague Elizabeth has already joined us as she was supposed.
Can you hear
Sorry?
me?
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to give the floor to Elizabeth now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Are you happy to continue to move the slides forward, Laura?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. You can probably anticipate when I'm going to move forward. If not, I'll indicate. But thank you so much for kicking off, Laura, and well, hi to everybody. All our colleagues over in Columbia. It's really great to be here this afternoon. I'm privileged to share the INORMS scope model with you. So Laura's done a fantastic job of introducing the scope framework and kind of the basic principles of it. And so what I'm hoping to do in this second section of the presentation, and we're going to finish before the end of our 45 minutes to give you time to ask questions, because Laura, our timescales are slightly different to yours, as I'm sure you can imagine, and Laura needs to leave at the end of this session. So I'm going to talk about scope in practice. So as Laura mentioned, we have been running a series of workshops with different organisations, with funders, with universities, with publishers, to apply scope to some real life evaluation problems, to both kind of develop the model to see if it works, to see how we might kind of tweak it and make it better, but also to generate these case studies that Laura mentioned that other people can learn from and perhaps apply to their own setting. So the next slide highlights just the 4 case study examples that I'm going to talk through. I've added an additional one. I've forgotten that I've tweaked the slides, which is probably slightly problematic, but it's only 1 or 2 slides I've changed. So I've mentioned here 3 case study examples, but there's a 4th one. But the first is from Loughborough University, where they were seeking to evaluate their engagement with open research and how they could do that responsibly. The second is from the University of Glasgow, where they've just developed a new research strategy, and they were looking to evaluate engagement with a particular strand of that strategy, and they wanted particularly to see how they could prize supporting the careers of others. So how can we reward academics for not only developing their own career, but for supporting other people's careers? The third is from Emerald Publishing, where they were seeking to evaluate the diversity of their editorial boards. And the final one that I wanted to mention today, which isn't on this slide, is the joint UK funding bodies in the UK are seeking to redesign the next research excellence framework, the REF, via something called the Future Research Assessment Programme, and they've used scope for that as well. So in all 4 cases, in order to adhere to our principle of evaluating with the evaluated, workshops were held with those who would be subject to the evaluations. And INORMS were involved in the first of these 3 case studies and were involved in the kind of design process, but Research England actually used the scope model independently of the INORMS Research Evaluation Group to lead their own scope-led evaluation. So when we were running the workshops, we would essentially explore an element of scope, allowing a full kind of divergence of views, and then we'd have a core group of evaluators who would bring those views back into the room and distill the learnings down into something usable, and then we take those ideas back to the community being evaluated, have another meeting to diverge out. So there's this diverge, converge kind of model to ensure that we were evaluating with the evaluator, but we still had a focus to the evaluation. The owner of the evaluation was the evaluator. So come next slide, please, Laura. What did we actually learn from this process? So I think the first thing that we learned is that this first stage, this start with what you value stage, is often the most challenging stage. We don't often take the time as institutions, and I'm sure this goes beyond higher education, we don't take the time to think about what it is we actually value. We're so driven by what we can measure, or what external bodies measure, our national research frameworks or our funders or our rankings, etc. But it's actually a very fruitful thing to do for more than just the evaluation. Actually, it has other implications within the organisation, but it does really provide a guiding light for your evaluation. Another thing we've learned during our workshops is that you can view values in 3 different ways, 3 different levels, if you like, of granularity. And we ended up calling these super values, values, and sub-values. And what I mean by that is, at the highest level, we have these, what we might call super values. So most organisations have thought about what they value, and they'll have a short list of them, often stated as single words, things like transparency, inclusivity, collegiality, and they can be useful in steering the evaluation, but they usually don't provide enough content or detail to actually design a specific evaluation. Then we have what we call the values themselves, and we describe these as the things that you care about given your super values. And therefore these are the things that you actually want to evaluate. And you can understand your values by asking, how do my super values manifest themselves? So if I have a super value of transparency, how does that actually operate in my organization? And then finally, we have what we've called sub-values at the lowest level of granularity. And this is kind of understanding what your values look and feel like in your organization. And they can provide a really in-depth understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve through your evaluation. So how do you actually identify your values and your sub-values? Well, the questions that we've been asking in these workshops that we've been using are things like, you know, what do you value about the thing that you want to evaluate? And then we'll try and explore the negative space. So what don't you value about this thing? Or what value results when this thing happens? Or what does good look like? So what is a good candidate? What is good engagement with open research? You know, what is a truly diverse editorial board actually? And trying to tease out those things can be really helpful. The next slide shows us super values, values and sub-values in action. So this was University of Glasgow. And they have 3 super values in their research strategy. That's collaboration, creativity and careers. And as I said, in an effort to embed these super values in their institution, they identified this ambition to encourage support for the careers of others. So that was the value that they sought to evaluate, the embodiment of their super value. And having identified that value, they sought to understand its dimensions in the Glasgow context through a workshop with stakeholders. And then the final list of sub-values could then be used to inform their evaluation. I won't read those out, you can see them there. So the next slide goes on to thinking about context considerations. And through our workshops, we found it really useful to actually tease out all the different contexts in which you might want to evaluate the thing that you value, particularly as it does affect the impact or the risk of the evaluation, as Laura has mentioned. It's important to take one evaluative setting at a time because your approach will differ depending on the who, the what, and the discipline that you are evaluating. And one of our key learnings here has been the challenge of weighing the things that we're evaluating with other things that we also value. So yes, I want to evaluate, we value supporting the careers of others, but if we also value a strong publication record, how do those two things match up in reality? How can will they manifest themselves in practice? Which one do we value more? And so that kind of affects the context of your evaluation. So Emerald Publishing had a really good example of this. So they were looking at evaluating the diversity of their editorial boards, as I mentioned. So when we dug into this context question with them, it's clear that they were really seeking to incentivize greater diversity. So that was the context in which they were evaluating. That was the reason. However, when we spoke to a group of their editors and their board members, their challenge to us was that whilst seeking more diverse editorial boards was a good thing, there were also other editorial processes that needed attention. So dormancy, for example, where people join editorial boards but don't do anything, or a lack of guidance. So how often have you joined an editorial board and you don't know really what it is you're expected to do, you just join. So the outcome of this exercise was, yes, that they did want to continue to seek to incentivize and evaluate diversity in that way, but they also had this parallel program of work where they sought to enable greater diversity as well. And interestingly, one of their values was that it wasn't ultimately diversity that they sought to evaluate or enable, but a commitment to diversity. And that was important to tease out, as it completely changes how you evaluate. Are you looking to see how diverse is this, or are you looking to see, you know, how committed to diversity are we? And often when you're looking to incentivize behavior change, the first step is a commitment to that change, right? So that was an interesting finding. They also recognised that it wasn't just diversity along the lines of protected characteristics that they cared about, but disciplinary and subdisciplinarity diversity too. So it was important to them that editorial boards weren't dominated by specialists in one or two areas. The next set of learnings was around options, and we were always aiming, as Lara said, for a mixture of qualitative and quantitative indicators for things, depending on the value and the context. So this stage is really just about balancing them out. You might have quantitative indicators with an explanatory qualitative text, or qualitative rubrics that lead to quantitative scores, for example. And we usually draw on other models for inspiration here to help people to broaden their thinking about the art of the possible, because we all know the poor metrics, right? We all know the things we don't want to use, but we're often short of ideas as to what we can use instead. And the DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment resource library, is a really good tool for this. It's very helpful. There's a selection of different evaluation approaches that they present there for different settings. So the next slide talks about this recent example of the use of scope, which was by the UK joint research funding bodies as they seek to design the next research excellence framework, the REF, via this future research assessment programme. And they are using scope to inform this work. And in their workshops with stakeholders, they actually use these spectra to help stakeholders and try and gauge the appetite from the stakeholders for various options. And I thought this was quite an interesting approach, and so I'm sharing it more widely as we talk about scope. So they looked at things like the extent to which the next REF might be automated. You know, where would you say your appetite lay as a group of evaluators, organisations on this spectrum? You know, the extent to which the assessment might be centralised, and the level of granularity at which the exercise might be focused. So that was an interesting tool to use in the options space. The next set of learnings was around probe. And what we've learned here is that this stage can, to a large extent, be considered alongside options. So every time you propose an option for evaluating, you ask, well, who might this discriminate against? How might this be gained, etc. However, it does also, we've learned, need to be reconsidered after designing the evaluation, but also after running the evaluation, because some consequences can't be predicted, right? We don't, when we design things, we don't always like to fully stress test them because we've created this beautiful thing and we don't want to break it. But it's often only after we've run the evaluation that we think, I didn't see that coming. I didn't predict it would have that outcome. I didn't predict it would incentivize that behavior. So we do need to keep probing, not just at the design stage, but after the evaluation stage, which is why our final stage is so important. So the example that I've got here is back to our open research example at Loughborough University. And we asked here, so, you know, who, when seeking to evaluate open research, you know, who might this discriminate against? Well, we know, for example, that not all disciplines have an equal opportunity to engage with open research currently. So we have to be careful that we're not imposing a standard expectation around open research practice that only some of our disciplines can actually engage with. In terms of how it might be gained, well, we didn't want to introduce, for example, percentage of open outputs on the repository, whatever indicators that might incentivize people not to put their outputs on the repository if they were closed, for example. And in terms of unintended consequences, you know, at Loughborough, they were very aware of the danger of this and culture. And I think with open research, often it can be seen as a whole additional raft of expectations on academic staff. It's not a new set of expectations, it's an additional set of expectations. So we have to be careful that our new indicators don't actually displace old ones and don't just become another thing to worry about for academics. There's also a danger of generating a compliance culture. I have to make my data available and I have to pre-register my research, rather than academics just seeing this as the way to do science. The way to do scholarship is in an open and transparent way. So Loughborough, having considered all of these, having probed their evaluation approach, they agreed to this general approach of celebrating open research successes wherever they found them, rather than expecting everybody to be at a threshold level immediately. The final stage is obviously to evaluate your evaluation, and this is where we need to ask whether the evaluators actually got useful intelligence or outcomes from their evaluation. And the critical question here is, what does success actually look like? But the challenge is, when do you ask that question? So how long should you give an evaluation before you decide whether it was successful or not? Particularly if you're looking to incentivize behavioral change. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. There's suggestions that if you change your evaluation approach regularly, it stops gaming, but then it affects the ability to have trend data because you're changing your approach year on year. So that's an interesting question. And if, of course, the approach wasn't right, you can then recycle, as Laura said, around the scope process, were your values right, etc. And if we return to the University of Glasgow's evaluation of the support for the career of others, the way that they approached it was, after identifying a way of evaluating researchers' support for the careers of others, their attention then turned to how they might evaluate their evaluation. So they went back to scope to evaluate their scope evaluation. So in terms of start with what they value, it was questions around, what did you value about running this evaluation? Was it ultimately individuals committed to supporting the careers of others that you wanted? Was it careers that have actually been supported? Was it creating an expectation, a culture of support? In terms of context, at what level of granularity do they want to evaluate the evaluation? Is it individuals? Is it departments? Is it university-wide? And for what purpose? Is it because they want to tell success stories about their approach of supporting others? Is it because they want to monitor progress on this? Why are they running the evaluation? In terms of options for evaluating the evaluation, there's all sorts: dedicated staff surveys, case studies, faculty reviews. Are they using existing data? Are they using new data? Could they use destinations of graduates, etc., etc.? And then in terms of probe, the question was, will this evaluation approach actually provide the required answers for us at the price that we're willing to pay? So that's how you might apply scope to scope effectively, hence this kind of cyclical, iterative approach. So I hope that was helpful. You've heard scope in theory, you've heard scope in practice now. I hope that was interesting to you. I guess Lara and I would be very keen to hear your thoughts, throw a discussion out to you really around what responsible evaluation challenges you face in your organisations, whether you think scope could be a useful tool in your own setting, and how could the scope model perhaps be improved in your view. So INORMS, as Lara mentioned, is a global organisation. We don't have representatives from every country, unfortunately. We'd like to. So when we kind of go around sharing this model, we're always very interested to learn how this might work in different cultural settings. So that's pretty much us. I shall hand back perhaps now to Cesar. Are you going to host the Q&A, or do we just open this up? I'm not quite sure.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Laura. It has been a very insightful talk and a great sharing from you for us. So let's see which questions come from the audience, and I will be happy to share it with you both. So, el espacio de preguntas está abierto para todos, o de comentarios también, no necesariamente preguntas, sino comentarios que alguien quiera hacer al respecto de la presentación de Laura y de Elizabeth. I'm gonna make the first question, Laura and Elizabeth. And probably more than a question, is a comment that I would like you to elaborate about. Mostly, this approach to research evaluation is fundamentally based on reading the local context, on reading what we have there at the university, in our scientific community. However, I wonder, how can we reduce the risk of becoming quite isolated and not making our research comparable with the research that happens around the world? So how do we reduce the risk of being just us looking at ourselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm occasionally asked this. Well, it might be a related question, but you know, I have people concerned that if they're evaluating their research in a more responsible way, that it's somehow going to make the research poorer and less comparable. But I think and I'm not sure if that's entirely your question, but I think my response to that is there's an expression that we use in the UK. I'm not quite sure how global this is, but that you don't fatten a pig by weighing it, right? So you're not going to make your research better or worse by measuring it in any particular way. You know, the research is the research, right? And measuring research in a more responsible way is not going to impact on the effect that what that research actually is, or the value of that research. It's just going to make evaluation kind of fairer. And I think it is a concern, I understand, but I guess I would try to reassure people that there is global interest in responsible research evaluation. So the Global Research Council, as Laura mentioned at the outset, had a global event looking at responsible research evaluation last year. They've got another focus of the next Global Research Council meeting is going to be on responsible research assessment. And I'm hopeful that ultimately, you know, principles around responsible research evaluation will at least filter through to global funders. So there's some kind of standard approach towards research evaluation globally. Not entirely standard, obviously, because we want to maintain the important differences between us, but research is a global endeavour. So I'm hopeful, and I think certainly with new assessment approaches like narrative CVs, I'm not sure that's something that has been explored much entirely globally. I know it's very much a focus in Europe. In terms of a narrative CV, I think it's critically important that there is some kind of consensus as to what we value there. Otherwise, we're going to have a proliferation of different forms of narrative CV requirement, which means that every time an academic applies for a job in a different country or for a different funding body, they're going to have to rewrite their narrative CV, right? So there needs to be some kind of global consensus, or perhaps a core of global consensus, but with natural kind of local differences. I don't know, Laura, what would you respond to that question?
Well, I suppose I'd start where I agree with you completely what you were talking about, but that's sort of on the higher level. And when you think about the practical level of evaluating research, and I come from Finland, which is a very small country in terms of science and research. So we're constantly looking outside to see the comparability of our research. And when it comes to research evaluation of institutions, for instance, universities, it's always an international peer review evaluation. So we sort of, when we are evaluating our own research, we always ask from someone else than someone from Finland what it looks like. So I think that's sort of a practical advice on how to sort of not curl up within your own country.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, very good. Thank you both, Laura and Elizabeth. Very interesting responses. And I think, Elizabeth, you had mentioned the fact that doing this type of assessment is not necessarily, or is no guarantee that the quality of the research is gonna increase or is gonna decrease. And this leads me to another question or to another comment, and is how can we try to stimulate or to motivate researchers to take on board this approach? Because I think it's something that is it's from the structures, from the university structures, and it comes from policies, and it comes from all of this regulation, but also it comes from the community that is there in the day-to-day practice of research. So on your experience, how do you perceive that, which are the best ways, or which ways have worked to get researchers embracing this approach, to get researchers getting to wanting to take the challenge, because in a way it's a challenge, to go into responsible research assessment?
A really good question. And I think, researchers tend to be quite polarized on this. I think they don't like being treated unfairly. They don't want to be ranked unfairly on publication measures and indicators. We hear in our role, mine and Laura's, we hear horrible stories of academics experiencing severe mental health issues through feeling like they're constantly being watched, having to go comparing themselves with others, feeling as though the expectations on them are really high, and yet others want to know, they want the certainty of an existing framework. They want to know how many publications they'll need to get promoted and what their H index needs to be, et cetera, et cetera. And particularly those who've actually made it in the current setting. It's very hard for those who've won using in the current evaluation systems to identify what the problem is, because it worked for me. Until you kind of ask them to, well, look around you, who else is winning? Where's the diversity there? So it's quite hard to get that group to engage. I think early career researchers are generally keen to be evaluated more fairly on a broader range of things, to kind of be a bit more critical about what it is that they're actually doing. But they are also worried, going back to your first question, they're also worried that if they do pursue, or they don't pursue highly cited papers in highly cited journals and generating a high level of research income, they're not going to be assessed fairly. So I think that we've seen this in the, and Stefan might talk about this in his next presentation, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but I know in the experience of Dutch colleagues with the new kind of more liberal evaluation approaches there, early career researchers, I understand, are very supportive in principle, but worried in practice about how employable this will then make them. Hence this need for, a kind of a global agreement as to what we actually value about research and researchers, in order to ensure that our assessments are fair, and we're ultimately creating the research environment. We are winning the right people to this career to do their best work, to create problems to our society's solutions to society's problems that we really need. Laura, I've talked a lot, sorry.
Well, I'd just like to sort of continue that I think the worries that the early career researchers actually have is very valid. And this needs to start from funding organizations and evaluating organizations. Like we can tell the researchers that don't put your H index there and don't care about the cited, high cited journals and everything. But as long as the funders aren't using the same principles, it's like the ones who actually want to operate in a responsible way are the losers. So I think this is one of those things that actually need to come from the top down, and we can't put the responsibility on the shoulders of the researchers. And on a practical note, as I'm now doing a research evaluation in our university, from the very beginning, we've been discussing with the units of assessment, with the researchers, what kinds of indicators they wish to show to the panels, what kind of assessment criteria they think would be suitable for them and for their purposes. So on a larger scale, when it comes to an organization, or even when it comes to a country, I think that our principles, evaluating with the evaluators, is one of the best ways to motivate, because people are actually now quite excited about the research evaluation as they have designed it themselves, partly.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Elizabeth. There is a question from Anna Aldana, Elizabeth and Laura, and Anna is part of our audience today. Anna is asking us, or is asking you, in your framework, is research evaluation different from research monitoring? How can institutions understand the difference between the scope of these two processes?
That's a good question. So it might just be a semantics issue here. So we use the phrase research evaluation to include all of those different, we've got these 6 levels of research assessment that we use, of which one is actually monitoring. So we would include monitoring as one of 6 approaches to research evaluation. But others, I can see the root of the question though, that monitoring is, I suppose because we're looking at, in the scope framework, all sorts of research, all sorts of entities, all sorts of processes. We're looking at, how to evaluate a research project, how to evaluate a researcher, how to evaluate engagement with open research, how to evaluate diverse editorial boards. We're looking at a whole range of entities and disciplines, and so we wanted a process that would work for them all. We've just used the word evaluation to cover all of those things. We say that monitoring is one of those. I hope that answers the question. I'm happy to take a follow-up if not.
And if Laura is not going to comment on that, I am going to share a comment from the audience from Yulitza Contreras. Basically, Yulitza is telling or is sharing with all of us that breaking paradigms and breaking the paradigm for research evaluation is quite difficult, because basically the sentence that we hear more often is, how can we measure this? So we tend to focus, or the community tend to focus on those things that traditionally has been labeled with not being a measurable subject or a measurable aspect of the research. And she said that this is a big challenge for all of us. And I ask you both if you had came across with situations where you can say, well, this cannot be measured. When you are trying to implement a responsible research approach, if you have came across with aspects that you said, hang on, this cannot be measured, or we don't know yet how to measure this. I know the question can be quite broad, but probably sharing a bit of that experience with us will set for us a window that open our eyes to start identifying ways of coming close to those aspects that are no measurable from our perspective right now.
Yeah, so much. One of the reasons that we set up the scope framework was to try and counteract this kind of obsession with measuring and counting everything, and the whole, if it can't be counted, it doesn't count type thing. I would say that not everything can be measured. I would say that I've yet to come across something that can't be assessed or evaluated in some way. If there's something that you value about this thing, so if the question was, how do we measure this, right? Well, my question is, what's this? What is this that you want to measure? What do you value about this thing that you want to evaluate? Once you've got the values, then you start thinking about what it is, how it is that you might evaluate that thing in your context, okay? So for a lot of qualities, it's a lot more difficult because you've got only qualitative approaches to work with. So peer review, essentially, in some form. And then it's quite difficult to, you can't count it, you can't stack it up. Although, having said that, you know, I come from the UK and we've just got to the end of our UK Research Assessment Excellence Framework, got the name of it for a sec. And that is a peer review exercise that results in scores. So they have rubrics by which they kind of assess every single research paper that they read, and then they kind of say, it meets these qualitative criteria, therefore it's 4-star. It meets these qualitative criteria, therefore it's a 3-star. So it's possible to score qualities in some way if you're prepared to put the effort into creating that framework. So I don't know, Lara, are there things that you would say just simply cannot be, that can't be assessed? I think there are things that can't be measured, but are there things that can never be assessed?
I'd say that societal impact is really tricky. And it's not just because it's sort of impossible to measure, but it's also that we don't really have an agreement on what societal impact means. So basically, it is something that is very valued, that is on all of it's on the global agenda, that research should be producing societal impact, but it's something that's very vague and sort of not enough constructed term yet for us to be able to assess it in its entirety. You know, we can be assessing some parts of societal impact, some sort of manifestations of societal impact, for instance, spin-offs and startups and, you know, patterns and stuff. But then when it comes to, for instance, increasing understanding on societal phenomena, that's something that we can't even assess. And also it's something that we can't say that who done it, you know? So we can't sort of give the credit to anyone, because this can be something that's been building up for tens of years. And then you're supposed to be able to pinpoint that this is someone who did this, and now they can be assessed for creating this societal impact. So I think that is a lovely example of something that really can't even be assessed properly.
But that, Laura, take us to say that basically this last question, I think, just to try to wrap up this part of the conversation, it leads me to think that probably there is where collaborations comes perfectly on place. And it's not collaboration just to do the research, it's collaboration to feed forthcoming research. And to be able to say that this research that I am developing is based on previous research, and that this step that I am now walking has been set by previous research and by previous action. So it's the acknowledgement of the whole research community rather than the outcome of one research project. And probably that, in a way, help us to frame the way that we assess research, just not thinking as I did it, or the three of us did it, but this is part of it's a result of an ongoing process of research. Laura, thank you so much. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time, for your insightful comments, for sharing with us your framework. I am sure that the audience has a lot more to say, but we need to try to stick to the times. And we are now going to give Stefan the microphone. And thank you so much to you both for being here today.
Yeah.
Muchas gracias a Laura, Elizabeth y por supuesto a Lida por acompañarnos en esta sesión de preguntas. Continuamos entonces con una presentación sobre innovación en investigación responsable a cargo de Stefan Kuhlmann. Stefan es profesor titular de Ciencia, Tecnología y Sociedad en la Universidad de Twente, en el Departamento de Tecnología, Política y Sociedad, y en la sección de estudios de Ciencia, Tecnología y Política. También es director académico del WTMC de la Escuela de Investigación de Posgrado Holandesa de Ciencia, Tecnología y Cultura Moderna. Stefan trabaja en la investigación y la innovación tecnológica como procesos sociales y políticos, centrándose en la gobernanza y la política, y publica ampliamente en el campo de los estudios de políticas de investigación e innovación. Antes de incorporarse a la Universidad de Twente, Stefan ocupó puestos de responsabilidad en el Instituto Fraunhofer de Investigación de Sistemas e Innovación en Alemania, y fue profesor de política de innovación en el Instituto Copernicus de la Universidad de Utrecht. En la década de 1980 fue investigador en la Universidad de Kassel, centrándose en la digitalización de la administración pública. Stefan, muy buenos días, welcome.
Buenos días, welcome. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Sí, sí, yes.
So it works, the sound works.
Yes, it
Anna, does the sound work?
Yes, it works.
Yes, it works.
Okay, great. That was an issue. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, organizers, Maria Alejandra, for this invitation, for this interesting conference on responsible metrics, responsible evaluation. I wanted to share with you the results and some conceptual suggestions that we have developed in the context of a major European research project dealing with responsible research and innovation. And in particular, we were focusing on the question of what kind of governance mechanisms would help to encourage, to strengthen responsible ways of doing research and innovation. Can you skip this slide, please? Go to the next. I have to apologize for the technical issues here. The reason is that in my city here where I live, the internet broke down today, and the whole city everywhere only can connect through the mobile phone. And I've sent these slides to Maria Alejandra to show them. But they are not exactly the slides that I wanted to use because I couldn't access the one that I had to prepare for today. So there are some slides that I simply have to skip. So please skip this slide number 2. Yeah, thank you very much. Now this one I wanted to start with. We are observing some changes in the kind of legitimation of research organizations, funding activities of the missions that universities are adopting, at least in Europe, we have seen that. That is, those who do research in universities, those who fund research in governments and in research councils and the like, seem to see the need to make sure that research is not simply done, but also in a responsible way that is legitimate, that society accepts research, that there is not too much doubt about the value and the truth of research. We have called it, or some people have called that a kind of a normative term that we have seen the last 15 years in research policy, in the legitimation of research policy. You see, for instance, that increasingly research organizations, universities, funding organizations, ministries, and the like, say that research should be directed and redirected and aiming to address so-called grand societal challenges, or the sustainable development goals more recently, or climate change should be addressed. So these are kind of normative orientations in research. We see that in the European Horizon 2020 program and a number of other initiatives that I don't want to discuss in detail now. Next slide, please. And in that context, the term of responsible research and innovation has come about. Obviously, that is our interpretation, trying to establish more legitimacy, and provide certain normative orientations for research policy. So what is called in Europe, and has used that acronym RRI, Responsible Research Innovation, that aims at improving the alignment of the impact of technology and innovation with the societal demands and values as far as possible. And that means, of course, there is an inherent degree of normativity in what is considered to be responsible. You see that also in the kind of political text, like the Rome Declaration of the European Commission already 6-7 years ago, in the various framework programs and the like. So in our understanding, we say RRI has been used as a kind of legitimacy resource for policy, for research funding, and for scientific communities. Next slide, please. So in this understanding, RRI aims to be quite comprehensive. It tries to address questions with which direction research innovation should take. As I said, addressing grand challenges, anticipating risks and taking care of ethical concerns, aligning research with societal demands, and stakeholders should be involved in research, and actors in research should take a responsive and forward-looking attitude to what they are doing. These are kind of expectations that come with RRI. Next slide, please. Here are some definitions which have become quite prominent. You find them in literature almost everywhere in the meantime. So René van Schomberg, for instance, one of those propagating RRI, says responsible research innovation is a transparent, interactive process in which societal actors and innovators become mutually responsive to each other with a view of the ethical acceptability, sustainability, societal desirability of innovation processes and marketable products. Or as Jack Stilgoe says, responsible research innovation means taking collective care for the future through stewardship of innovation in the present. You see, again, this high normative load, even though there might be some contradictions built into these definitions. And actually, what currently, or last few years, has been called responsible research innovation, RRI, is in a way historically conditioned, at least in Europe, because there were already in earlier years all kinds of exercises trying to include in the reasoning about what kind of research should be done, how it should be done, a consideration of the societal value, societal effects of research. Next slide, please. Anyhow, that's about the history. I don't want to delve deeply into it. In the European context, RRI has become almost a trademark of the research funding that the Commission had, and this is just stolen. This slide stolen from the Commission's official PowerPoint slides, just to show you what I mean with that: engagement, gender equality, science education, ethics, and open access. That was the kind of interpretation that the European Union has adopted last few years. Next slide, please. Skip that one, please. Next one. But yeah, as I said in the beginning, in our interpretation, this effort can be seen as a means to increase legitimacy of research and innovation activities and related funding. But how can one do that? Can one construct legitimacy proactively? And how can what is responsible or not in research and innovation be negotiated by the various actors and stakeholders? What kind of governance frame would be needed for research that should be directed towards more responsible behavior of actors in the field? Next, please. That brings me to a definition of governance as we use it. I know that there are many different definitions of governance. There's a neo-liberal kind of normative definition. We don't use that one. We use governance simply as a kind of a heuristic, studying the relations of all relevant research and innovation actors, their resources, their interests, their power, the fora for debate, the arenas for negotiation between them, the rules of the game, and the policy instruments applied to achieve legitimate agreements amongst them. That is the kind of definition that we use. And we are particularly, when it comes to responsible research and innovation processes, interested in what we would call meta-governance. That means, how could we organize the conditions of governance in a particular situation? Are there generic conditions or principles that would help us to organize governance situation in very different contexts? That means in different institutions, in different disciplines, different countries, and so on. That's what we are interested in particular in this project. Next one. Therefore, that brings us to the meta-governance approach is we applied, or in our context, we did that on what we would call the meso level of research and an innovation system. That means not the individual researcher, and not the country or so, or the European Union, what have you, but the organizations which have some power to organize and shape research and innovation processes within their own borders. That is, for instance, funding organizations, ministries, boards of universities or of companies, civil society organizations, or so. So this middle level of the system, there we think we can, that is what we aimed at, launch certain meta-governance principles that would help them to organize processes in a way that they could be considered responsible by the participating actors. And that includes, by the way, that brings us to the theme of today's conference, includes also the conditions under which people develop their careers. For instance, the metrics, the scores that are being used to assess the quality of profiles of researchers. That is one element amongst many that helps to govern research organization in a particular way. Next, please. Now, then there's people say, or have tried also, for instance, Jack Stilgo and others, to define responsible research and innovation so that you can measure or assess whether something is responsible or not. Well, in our approach, the project that I'm referring to, using this meta-governance approach, we would say what is responsible, what is responsibility, is always subject to value choices by those participating in a particular situation. So that you cannot escape that. That means choices that are made by whomever, by the board of a university, by a funding organization, by an individual researcher, they will be contested, at least in pluralistic societies. There will be always others with a different view of what is responsible or not in a particular situation. When it comes to a particular technology, the use of a technology, when it comes to particular research questions and related methodologies and the like. So contestation, will not be able to get rid of it. But what are then, if it's so, the conditions for constructive and productive negotiations between actors in contested environments? And how would we have to organize that if you take into account the multi-layered incumbent governance arrangements in research and innovation systems and policies, or within universities and the like? That were the kind of questions that we are interested in this project. Next, please. That means we would have first to understand the de facto situation in which responsible research and innovation is being implemented. Now, this break we will not have. That is from the wrong presentation. Please, the next one. So in our project, that was a project actually, as I said, funded by the European Commission with about 10 partners. And we ran the project between 2013 and 2016. There was the so-called Resagora project. You can Google it. At the end of the presentation, I'll give you links to it. We organized our research process in a way that we said, let's search for building blocks of a meta-governance framework for responsible research and innovation. And he developed a particular empirical approach for that. We did a number of case studies, very different, very diverse cases, different disciplines, different national context, different organizational context, different technologies, different kind of stakeholders and so on. In total 26, where we tried to understand through interviews, through all kinds of data retrieval and document analysis, so to identify what in the particular case actors involved, it means researchers, citizens, policymakers, and so tried what they have understood as being responsible and how what kind of arrangements they have made or not to organize the discourse about the contestation about responsibility. Also, we did a monitoring of RRI-related initiatives across 16 European countries. And in a three-stage deductive, inductive, analytical approach that brought us then to 13 transversal lessons that we found in terms of governance of responsible innovation, that we then further digested into a particular key set, towards a key set of principles that we'll share with you soon. Next, please. This is just to show the diversity of the case studies. I will not go through this list, but if you take a quick look, you will see how extremely diverse that was on purpose. So reaching from particular technologies to the governance of particular universities and so on and so forth. Very diverse on purpose to grasp, to gather as many as possible different aspects that can help us to build this overarching meta-governance framework. Next, please. As I said, through these case studies and the other steps that I have briefly touched upon, we call that an abductive approach, inductive, deductive, abductive approach, we developed a basic set of ideas of principles of which we thought that if they would be applied in a concrete context, on the meso level, for instance, the board of university or so, then they could help to identify ways that support responsible ways to do research innovation activities. In order to sharpen that context, we organized then a series of 5 workshops, interactive workshops, with in total 100 top-level participants from meso level organization. That means, yeah, as I said, boards of universities, funding organizations, ministries, and the like. They sent topical people to discuss with us, research managers, evaluation, heads of evaluation units, and the like, to discuss with us our principles and to further fine-tune what we have done interactively, or we called it a co-construction approach, and developed even an own method for that, which I cannot talk about today. Here on the right-hand side, you see a picture of one of the workshops that we conducted. Next slide, please. That's slow, yeah. Yeah. And then we developed on the basis of that, drawing on these workshops, what we have called the responsibility navigator, which is kind of one of the products of this project. And there is an own website where you can study the responsibility navigator. So you can Google it and can immediately approach it and use it. It is conceived as a communication tool, aiming to provide orientation for a better and normatively oriented steering of research and innovation in a particular direction, in a particular organizational context. Which one? That depends on those who use it. And we developed 10 principles and requirements that would allow for responsibility-related governance of research innovation in the respective context. And these principles were purpose developed and defined in a way that that are generic, that in principle you could interpret them against every related context. And in these navigator, we not only presented these principles, but also illustrated them with a number of fictive cases, trying to show what you can do with the principles. There were developed these fictive cases drawing on the actual cases that we had, on the real case studies, but we anonymized them in order to make them more widely applicable. And as I said, the users, supposed users, were meso-level organizations. I don't want to repeat it now. The reason was these are such organizations which really have the possibility to change the way research is being governed in a particular context. Next slide, please. And now we'll go quickly through these 10 principles. We organized them in 3 dimensions or 3 blocks. The first dimension or first block deals with efforts to ensure a quality of the interaction of those involved in a situation where responsibility is being negotiated. And it starts, most importantly, with the principle of inclusion. That means you should make an effort in a particular situation, for instance, in your faculty, in your university, if you want to organize responsible research in a responsible way, try to involve all actors that are necessary here to achieve that game. So that means the researchers themselves, but also their superiors, probably also the funding organizations that are in the background because they have an impact through funding something or not. You might think of representatives of other national, international organizations because they are the ones which also will observe the careers of individuals and eventually hire people. So that's important to keep also their perspectives in the picture. So, but what is inclusive depends very much on the context, and that has to be defined by those organizing these processes. Suppose all the relevant actors are there, then the interactions, the negotiations, and also contestation should be organized in a way that it is moderated. That means certain organizational modes need to be developed that support the exchange of ideas. Fora for discussion have to be institutionalized, places or procedures where people can actually meet and exchange has to be developed. And ideally, there's also one actor, be it an individual or be it an organization, which has a relatively neutral role so that she or he can organize the interaction processes. Then thirdly, all this is necessary to encourage deliberation. That means the exchange of knowledge claims and positions among the different actors in order to make sense together, and ideally in the end also to take certain decisions. And that means also that it is necessary to provide access to knowledge sources that are important depending on the context. Next slide, please. This block, the second block, deals with what we call positioning and orchestrating. That means it's more about the process and the implementation of the efforts to achieve a governance arrangements in an organization that help to support responsibility in research. That means, first, all arrangement should be developed and used here need to be modular and flexible. They need to be able to capture both hard and soft regulations that are in place there, or have to develop new ones. Also, it should allow for self-regulation in organizations. Should be able to refer to external control and accountability structures. Flexibility is necessary to adapt it to particular context, but at the same time should also not become arbitrary. Subsidiarity is the next one, which is important here because all our systems in which we do research generation are layered. Also within the meso level, you have different layers. And there are different regulations, different levels of expectation that have to be taken into account. And one has to think about on which level do I want to achieve what? And if I do something on level X, what would that mean to level Y? In an organization, for instance, within a university or so. Adaptability means the next principle that not only have a different organizational and context within meso-level organizations, but also historically they develop further. What was relevant yesterday might look differently today or tomorrow. What is considered to be responsible yesterday might be reconsidered tomorrow. That depends very much on the progress of science, knowledge, and also of technological development. So our arrangements here need to be adaptable to new situations. Next slide, please. Brings us to the third block or dimension, which we have called supportive environments. All the previous principles were very much procedural, talking about the conditions under which people act, could act, should act, want to act. These ones here have to do with the supporting context for that. People, individuals, as well as their the units, the organizations have to be capable and to support reflexive individuals, to reflexivity within in the given context, to deliberate, to communicate, to achieve the societally desired outcomes and processes. This is not cannot be taken for granted. Very often, research organizations, at least in the past, were run as quite authoritarian organizations, top-down governed. In such context, the capability to deal with these responsibility-oriented approaches is hardly developed. So that means people have to be trained to be able to apply the principle that we have just suggested. And that brings us to number 8, capacities. That means not only individuals and organizations have to be made fit, but at the same time, you need infrastructures, for instance, professional networks or educational measures that have to be set up that help to prepare people. And for instance, the professional organizations of researchers can do that. For instance, I've discussed this with professional organizations in the field of research evaluation. So research, the theme of the previous presentation, research evaluation professionals and their organizations can make efforts to develop the capabilities that I was talking about in the previous principle. And in order to achieve all this, brings us to the next principle or requirement, we also need in organizations and institutional people who push the processes into the desired direction. So that means leadership is required. Top level and continuous support is necessary. If the board of your university is not interested in these processes, you will not get very far. So that means they need to have some vision, some strategy. There's necessity for lobby work, and and rewards are necessary to support the people in that respect. So entrepreneurship, whether of individuals or of units, is required. And then we arrive at the very last supportive context, which one could think of as being, of course, taken for granted, but normally it is not in all contexts you would find it. That is a culture of transparency, of tolerance, and of the rule of law. Only if some basic democratic principles apply in a particular context, you can act along the principles that I suggested in the previous slides. Or you can also say, put it the other way around. You could say, if we would apply the principles that I've just suggested, that could help to improve the culture of transparency, tolerance, law in the respective organizational or context. But that is something to be discussed. So, next slide, please. So let me return to the initial question. What is needed to establish and ensure legitimacy for research and innovation policy? What kind of meta-governance frame can help to address the normative or directions that have been introduced into in research policy in the recent years, the related transformations that are called for? We would say, start from the de facto governance arrangement that you find in your meso-level organization, your university, your funding council, what have you. Try to mobilize institutional entrepreneurs, and on both on the institutional level and on the individual level. Develop the governance principles in a way that strategic reflection, navigation for transformation is facilitated, knowing that there is inherent contestation. That one does not reject this and neglect this, but starts from knowing that the contestation is inevitable and one has to cope with it. Next one, please. Therefore, we have developed these 3 dimensions that I don't want to repeat. They should be used in concrete context interactively, to jointly co-construct with the related stakeholders in their respective organizational context arrangements for responsible research and innovation. So that in view of these principles, responsibility can be debated and can be defined and redefined and also allocated, reallocated, depending on the direction to which transformation is aimed. And that includes also helping through navigation through alternative scenarios in order to address alternative variations that one could go for. Next one, please. And in the end, it brings us to the question I already addressed earlier. Capabilities and capacities are absolutely necessary here. People who are able, organizations who are able to work in this suggested way, and the related strategic intelligence is necessary. And our suggestion here is to draw on this navigator. I've provided here the internet address, and it offered to these meso-level actors that I've talked about. I know that several of them, for instance, the Research Council of Norway, to give just one example, they have made use of it. And we can also now discuss if it's interesting in your context, particularly when it comes to develop more appropriate ways to evaluate research and researchers, and more appropriate metrics, because I think that's the main interest of your network and the conference here, metrics in the field of research governance. The suggestion is to use these principles to make that more viable. That's it. Thank you very much. The next two slides are references. That might be interesting for you, but I don't want to go through them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it worked more or less well technically, given these unfortunate technical conditions that I'm a victim of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you so much. Well, from this moment on, we are going to open the conversation, Stefan. So we might get some comments and questions from the audience, and we will discuss it. So, para las personas que tienen preguntas o comentarios que hacer, estamos en el espacio de hacerlas. Stefan, in the meantime, I'm going to ask you one of my questions, so we start this conversation. Within the framework of responsible research, we hear very often, and probably one of the key words when we talk about responsible research is the word context. And the word context come very often. We need to look at the context. We need to read the context. We need to determine the criteria for research from the context. And this might be a broad question, Stefan, but in this framework, how will you define context? What will be that meaning of context? What do you mean, or what the community means by saying, let's take into account the context? Because one can think context can be the researchers community. Context can be the political setting in a given country. Context can be the political setting in an institution. So what do we understand by context when we talk about, when we use this word in responsible research assessment?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, of course, a very important question, clearly. And I've used a lot this notion of context, or for the principles, this navigator that we have developed, we set on purpose. This makes sense only as a meta-governance framework. It makes sense only if it is used in the context of meso-level organizations. That means, I don't want to, I've said it repeatedly, of such organizations which have some organizational power to design the conditions under which people do their research. That means which design the incentives, be it the salaries, be it the promotion criteria for individuals, be it with the funding modes for research, and so on and so forth. All these partly regulatory, partly resource-oriented measures that have an impact on how people behave. This is then the context, but even that context, of course, is highly variable from university A to B, from funding council A to B, from country to country, from disciplinary context to disciplinary context in different technological domains. So this variety is there, but to make it not too general, we focus here, and once more I repeat that, on this meso level, not speaking about the individual and their respective context, because then you would have billions of different contexts, but on that level, which is still quite broad, and I know, but it makes a difference whether I interpret these principles, for instance, and make them working in, for instance, my university for the entire university. Or whether I do that in a, let's say, in a company which develops, I don't know what, electrical cars or so. It's a very different context. And therefore, these kind of contexts, that meso level that I'm talking about, those. And the definition you ask for, or the delineation that you ask for, comes from that choice that one makes. And so in the end, it's actually those to whom we offer our navigator, who themselves are the ones today. This is our context. I don't know whether this is really a response to your question.
Yes, Stefan, it did. Thank you so much. Let's give some time to the audience, Stefan, and probably they are busy right now taking notes and constructing the questions or comments. We invite our audience to take part in this conversation by writing questions or making some comments in our chat. We have a question here, Stefan. It's a question that came to us through the chat. Could you please tell us or share with us which were the key points for the RRE framework?
With the key points?
Yes, Stefan.
Our framework.
Yep.
I'm not speaking about the broad discussion in Europe and the US and elsewhere about responsible research and innovation. That's very broad. The beginning of my presentation I sketched it briefly. Once more, I said we focus on these meso-level organizations. For that purpose, we developed this, whether you can see that, this navigator booklet and so. And here, once more, the focus is on saying we cannot define for the users of that navigator what is responsible. We cannot do that. First, because it's anyhow contested. Second, there are different stakeholders in each context which have different views. Therefore, we abstain from substantive definitions of responsibility, and rather we suggest procedural principles, how to organize processes of negotiating, of debating, of designing, and at some point maybe also on agreeing what is considered to be responsible in the chosen context within which that is being done. These are then become these 10 principles which I do not want to repeat. But these are the core elements of our concept. I know that there are others, literature. For instance, the paper by Jack Stilgo and others that I was referring to, and there are more of that, they come up with a set of 4 or 5 basic orientations, of which they say they hold, full stop. I would say maybe, but first we differentiate them somewhat, and secondly, there are these diverse contexts that we talked about already. Therefore, there is flexibility and adaptability necessary. And therefore, this approach that our project is not different from the others, but an attempt to develop it further for these type of organizations that I talked about.
Thank you, Stefan. And there is another question, Stefan. There is one person asking us or asking you, what do you think will be the key points for a public policy in Colombia for implementing research, responsible research?
That's a good question. Yes. I mean, knowing a little bit the situation in Colombia, even though I'm not a Colombian, I would say the most important thing is to give the organizations of research and innovation, particularly research organizations, higher education organizations, but also the funding organizations. That means the universities and the Experiencias and so, to give them more institutional stability. Because I have observed them through the last 15 years or so, and I've seen quite some instability, and therefore sometimes also a lack of reliability. That's the first thing, and which is difficult, I know, but of course related to the general political situation and stability or instability that you have there. That's clear. But the stability also includes that in the country, in the general politics of the country, the value and the relevance of education and research is accepted, has to be more accepted, has the relative role of research and education for the development of a desirable future for the country needs to be accepted to a higher degree by broader audience and by a broader political audience. If this is the case, then also the institutional stability of such organizations, I guess, will be better. And then you would, within these organizations, the universities, the ministry, the funding organizations, what have you, also be put in a situation that this reflection along the lines of the principle that I have suggested becomes possible. And I've seen efforts in some organizations earlier already in Experiencias and so to develop some of those approaches, but they were not very stable. That was the problem in my perception. So there have been very interesting efforts actually, but yeah, they were suffering from the institutional instability, which does not sufficiently value the role of research and education in the country. I think that's the key thing that I see on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's also another observation that over the years, the propensity of relevant actors, particularly of younger people in universities, but also the government, to value indeed research and education as important for the future of the country is increasing, is improving. So I think there's some reason to be hopeful.
Thank you, Stefan. Hernán.
Sí. Hola, Lida.
Quizás sea este un buen momento para, en compañía de Stefan, abrir los micrófonos y escuchar a las personas que nos están acompañando hoy en sus opiniones sobre el proceso que hemos hecho a lo largo de este año y sobre los retos que nos plantea las conversaciones que hemos tenido hoy. Si lo quieren hacer en inglés o en español.
Creo que es muy valioso. Creo que es muy valioso. Así es. Qué pena, Lida.
Dale, adelante tú.
Sí, creo que es muy valioso. Como muchos nos han acompañado a lo largo de este proceso, 2 eventos académicos, 5 cátedras. Entonces sería muy interesante para nosotros también conocer sus opiniones, sus apreciaciones. Creo que este proceso, pues, como lo planteó Elizabeth, al inicio nos va a dejar 2 productos que sabemos que van a ser de mucho interés para las instituciones, pero también más allá de eso, lo que significa abrir un espacio de discusión de este nivel. Entonces, quien tenga deseo de opinar, quien quiera darnos sus apreciaciones, sus aportes sobre este proceso, pues los micrófonos están abiertos, como dijo Alida, lo pueden hacer en inglés o en español sin ningún inconveniente, y para nosotros también sería de mucha importancia escucharlos.
Stefan, we are going to open the microphone to the audience, and we will be very grateful if you could stay with us for this part of the chat, in case people had some questions or comments to share with you.
Okay.
Ya los micrófonos están abiertos. Bienvenidos quien quiera aportar. Perfecto. Como lo hemos mencionado, para nosotros este ha sido un proceso muy interesante, de muchísimo aprendizaje. Entonces, quiero darle la palabra nuevamente a Elizabeth Bernal, coordinadora académica de ASCUN, para que nos dé unas palabras de cierre. Pues, sería cierre de este proceso alrededor de las cátedras, pero esperamos que no sea un cierre de la discusión que se abre alrededor de este tema que sabemos que es de suma importancia para todos en las respectivas instituciones. Elizabeth, tienes la palabra.
Vale, Hernán, muchísimas gracias a nuestros expertos invitados el día de hoy. Muchas gracias, Alida, también por la moderación de las conversaciones. Bueno, entonces, en efecto, sabemos que en este momento no lo estamos mencionando, pero hay mucho por conversar, hay mucho por reflexionar. En la línea de política pública, que es la línea en la que nos estaba comentando Stefan, y que también tuvimos otras experiencias en estas 5 cátedras, sabemos que tenemos un trabajo a seguir. Inicialmente, revisar qué elementos del modelo y de las, digamos, de la manera como estamos actualmente viviendo la evaluación de la ciencia, la tecnología e innovación, cuáles de estos elementos consideramos que necesitan un ajuste o un cambio, un poco como lo mencionó César al comienzo, cuáles son estos principales problemas que vemos, y luego lo que tenemos, el reto y en lo que vamos a trabajar es cómo estos problemas o cómo estos ajustes se pueden efectivamente viabilizar, ¿no? Cómo se pueden hacer realidad en el país. Hay algunos aspectos, digamos, que son muy amplios, que son de cambios, si se quiere, culturales o de prácticas fuertemente arraigadas en el país, que tendrán un camino, pero aquellos aspectos que consideremos que se pueden ya iniciar a tocar desde política pública, bien sea desde decisiones de formuladores de política, como ya desde aspectos de más amplio espectro, digamos legales, la idea es identificar cuál aspecto sí puede iniciarse desde la política pública, cuál otro aspecto depende de unos cambios legales mayores. Entonces ese es el segundo paso en el que nos encontramos. El primero, identificación de problemas, intenciones de cambio. El segundo, viabilidad, qué debe ser, qué podría ser cambio en política pública de tomadores de decisión, qué tendrían que ser cambios legales y qué elementos tendríamos que irnos por transformaciones culturales, si me permiten el término. Y luego de ello, nuestra tercera fase es, ya habiendo analizado un poco el problema, teniendo analizada la viabilidad, ya establecer en un documento las sugerencias de acciones en términos de política pública. Entonces, lo que nos planteó Stefano y lo que nos han planteado en general en las cátedras, ese avión está cerca de mi casa, nos va a servir para este proceso. ¿Qué esperamos tener en el 2022? Por lo que nos mencionaba Hernán, este es un proceso que estamos iniciando. Esta cátedra hace parte del cierre del primer abrebocas del tema. Entonces, en el 2022 queremos presentarle al país una primera propuesta en línea de política pública, teniendo en cuenta estos 3 elementos y discutirla ampliamente. Y el otro camino que estamos viviendo, que fue con lo que escuchamos también en la exposición de INORMS, que amablemente pues nos acompañaron, y que Elizabeth todavía se encuentra acá con nosotros escuchándonos, es, bueno, y las instituciones que quieren ya avanzar hacia esta línea, aun cuando no se den grandes cambios en el ámbito nacional, que podrían comenzar a hacer. Y acá hemos empezado a identificar también elementos muy interesantes. Lo primero que estamos haciendo con las instituciones es hacer un análisis institucional de la capacidad de acción, ¿no? Sabemos que de todas maneras dependemos bastante de maneras de medir la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación tanto en ámbitos nacionales como internacionales, y que las instituciones no pueden hacerse a un lado de estos procesos, pero que sí se puede comenzar a hacer. Y en esta línea, entonces, lo que estamos proponiendo es primero una caracterización de las instituciones, por supuesto, siempre el primer paso, que las instituciones se revisen internamente cuáles son estas, tanto las unidades como las políticas, como los procesos que se están viviendo en este momento en relación con la evaluación, cuáles elementos serían susceptibles de cambio, cuáles no, y cómo comenzar a pensarnos en sistemas internos o sistemas, digamos, articulados de evaluación de la ciencia, la tecnología e innovación. Entonces, lo primero que queremos ofrecerle a las instituciones son algunas herramientas para hacer esta caracterización previa interna, y luego de ello algunas posibilidades en relación con la caracterización que se haya realizado. Entonces, por ejemplo, hay instituciones que nos dicen, mire, nosotros creemos que deberíamos partir de una sensibilización interna sobre el tema. Otros que nos mencionan, nosotros ya tenemos una sensibilización, pero necesitamos hacer un análisis de la estructura organizacional de la institución, porque probablemente necesitamos involucrar a más unidades de las que están en este momento involucradas. Otras instituciones nos dicen, no, tenemos que cambiar una política. Otras instituciones nos dicen, nosotros ya vamos avanzando hacia este tema, realmente lo que tenemos que hacer es seguir fortaleciendo procesos que ya iniciamos. Entonces, lo que queremos hacer es, después de dar algunas pistas, de hacer esta autocaracterización, dar pistas sobre qué pueden hacer las instituciones dependiendo cómo, en qué lugar se encuentren. Y por supuesto, pues al final lo que sí quisiéramos es establecer un punto de encuentro entre qué pueden y qué quieren iniciar las instituciones y cómo esto lo hacemos coherente con una política nacional. Para ello, el próximo año, además de generar este instrumento, queremos proponerle también al país y a todas nuestras instituciones que aquellas que quieran iniciar un piloto, o que nos quieran mostrar, digamos, experiencias que ya tienen relacionadas con esta línea, pues lo podamos hacer. Vamos a hacer un seguimiento ya a instituciones que quieran poner en desarrollo de alguna manera esta propuesta. Un poco lo que les decimos, va a haber distintas líneas, la línea de política institucional, la línea, por ejemplo, de sensibilización, o línea de formación también de comunidades académicas, etc. Entonces, vamos a tener este instrumento, una experiencia, o ojalá varias experiencias, digamos, pilotos sobre el tema. Vamos a tener también este aporte desde la política pública, y al final queremos también para el próximo año poner, digamos, en discusión cómo estos elementos pues nos ayudan a hacer los cambios que se requieran. Hasta el momento es bastante la información que hemos tenido. Nos alegra saber que estas nuevas tecnologías nos permiten que no solo las personas que estuvieron de manera presencial en estos eventos, sino las que no pudieron, puedan observarlos. Vamos a invitarlos, les vamos a compartir a todas las personas que estuvieron las memorias de las 5 cátedras, y vamos a hacer un análisis transversal sobre cuáles son los puntos en común de las distintas exposiciones que hemos tenido. Creo que hoy hay varios aviones cerca, pasando por acá. Vamos a hacer este análisis. También vamos a recoger la información que se ha obtenido de las distintas comisiones, y toda esta información va a ser inicialmente analizada por un equipo central que ha sido el equipo gestor de esta propuesta. Luego de tener digamos, ya el análisis previo, este análisis va a ser pasado a las comisiones. Luego esperamos presentarlo a nuestra comisión de comité científico, que son, digamos, personas que han tenido mucha experiencia en el tema, para que ya nos aporten sobre los dos resultados y pues seguir avanzando el segundo semestre del año. De nuevo, entonces, todas las instituciones que hemos estado involucradas en este proceso nos comprometemos a continuarlo. Tanto ACU como ASCUN, como el Observatorio, el Consorcio Colombia y la red de gobernanza en ciencia, tecnología, innovación y de gestión, de gestores de investigación, vamos a mantenernos en el proceso, y la intención es poder presentarle al país una propuesta ya específica sobre lo que se puede hacer. Decíamos iniciando las cátedras que hace unos años nos decían, sí, el discurso es muy bonito, pero no se puede avanzar hacia allá, o el discurso es muy bonito, pero no tenemos evidencias de que esto resulte. Ya nos hemos dado cuenta que no solo es un discurso bonito, sino que ya hay países que están haciendo implementaciones y tenemos ejemplos de instituciones, redes de instituciones y pues también organizaciones que apoyan a las instituciones que ya están avanzando en esta línea. Entonces la idea es aprovecharlas. También estamos generando, pues estamos haciendo parte de las redes latinoamericanas y las redes internacionales que quieren potenciar este tema. Queremos también dar un parte de tranquilidad. Hubo una institución que nos comentó, digamos que nos dijo, no, un momento, no nos vayan a colocar otro modelo de medición, ya tenemos bastantes, que lo que venga no sea una carga. Tal vez en una lectura muy inicial de lo que es métricas responsables. Entonces sabemos que tenemos que seguir manejando y cualificando el discurso. Esto no son métricas distintas, no es la construcción de 100 indicadores paralelos a los que ya se viven, es toda una reflexión sobre cómo y por qué estamos haciendo la medición de ciencia, tecnología e innovación. Sabemos que por ejemplo, en la Agenda 2030, en el año 2030 se van a medir los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, y allí pues en gran parte se va a hacer la pregunta sobre qué tanto todos los procesos que venimos desarrollando de investigación y de innovación le han aportado a las grandes problemáticas mundiales y locales. Entonces, pues sigue siendo la invitación abierta, seguimos muy dispuestos a recibir sus comentarios y también sus iniciativas. Nuestra idea es seguir abriendo este tipo de ciclos. Si, por ejemplo, en sus instituciones o ustedes mismos identifican que deberíamos abordar algunos otros temas, o que sería interesante incluir algún elemento o invitar otras instituciones, otras personas, pues bienvenidos. En el correo que les vamos a compartir, que es el correo de Métricas Responsables, estamos dispuestos a recibir toda la información. Entonces, bueno, no siendo más, les deseamos una buena tarde y bueno, y esperamos que esto siga siendo un aliciente para continuar.
Muchísimas gracias, Elizabeth, Stefan, Elizabeth, Laura, a todos por habernos acompañado en la mañana de hoy. Por supuesto, seguiremos en contacto, estaremos comunicándoles previamente todos los resultados y, por supuesto, si llevamos a cabo algún otro tipo de evento. Alida, muchísimas gracias. A todo el equipo también que trabaja alrededor de Métricas. Muchísimas gracias. Un muy buen día.
Muchas gracias a todos. Buen día para todos, Stefan.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.